July 2, 1943, Castelvetrano Airfield, Sicily. The Focke-Wulf 190's pilot never saw the P-40 Warhawk diving from above until machine gun fire tore through his fuselage, sending his aircraft spiraling toward the Sicilian countryside below. First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, a 22-year-old from Brazil, Indiana, had just recorded what German Luftwaffe commanders believed impossible. A black pilot had shot down one of their elite fighter aircraft. The swastika painted on Hall's P-40L Warhawk that afternoon would become the first of 112 enemy aircraft destroyed by the men the Germans would reportedly come to call Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen. In Nazi Germany, racial doctrine classified black people as Untermenschen, subhuman, incapable of mastering complex machinery or demonstrating courage in combat. The Nuremberg laws had forbidden marriages between Germans and people of African descent. Yet here, above the Mediterranean skies, that ideology was about to collide catastrophically with reality as 992 trained pilots from Tuskegee, Alabama would systematically demolish both German aircraft and German assumptions about racial superiority. Like the video, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for more untold stories of heroes who shattered Nazi myths in the skies. What Hall didn't know as he pulled his smoking P-40 back toward base was that his victory represented far more than military success. In that moment of aerial combat over Sicily, he had fired the opening shot in a three-front war that would reshape American military history, challenge Nazi ideology, and prove that courage knows no color. What the Luftwaffe pilots didn't know as they climbed to intercept American bombers in 1943 was that they were about to face some of the most rigorously trained, highly motivated fighter pilots in the entire United States Army Air Forces. Men who had overcome obstacles their white counterparts never faced, who had trained harder and longer than standard pilots, and who carried into battle not just the weight of national duty, but the burden of proving an entire race's capability. The mathematics of aerial combat would soon be written in the skies over Europe. 15,533 combat sorties, 1,578 missions, 112 aerial victories, and a bomber escort loss rate significantly lower than white fighter groups. Statistics that would force even the most fanatical Nazi ideologues to confront the bankruptcy of their racial theories. But behind these numbers lay individual stories of extraordinary determination. Captain Lemuel Curtis, one of the original Tuskegee cadets, had worked as a janitor while earning his engineering degree, saving every penny for flying lessons. Lieutenant Robert Dees had walked 200 miles from his home in New Orleans to reach a train station that would take him to Tuskegee, carrying his belongings in a paper bag because his family couldn't afford a suitcase. The journey toward that first aerial victory began not in combat, but in the hostile environment of American segregation. In 1925, the U.S. Army War College had published a report titled Employment of Negro Manpower in War that concluded, compared to the white man, he is admittedly of inferior mentality. He is inherently weak in character. This official military assessment claimed that black soldiers lacked the intelligence for technical roles and the courage for combat leadership. Yet even as military leaders clung to these prejudices, a small group of black Americans was already proving them wrong. Eugene Bullard had flown 20 combat missions for France in World War I because America wouldn't let him serve, earning the Croix de Guerre and becoming known as the Black Swallow of Death. Bessie Coleman had earned her pilot's license in France in 1921 when no American flight school would accept her, returning to barnstorm across the American South, inspiring thousands despite facing constant discrimination. By the 1930s, the Coffey School of Aeronautics in Chicago had trained dozens of black civilian pilots, including Cornelius Coffey and Willa Brown, who would later become instructors at Tuskegee. These pioneers demonstrated that flying skill knew no racial boundaries, laying the groundwork for what would come. The civilian aviation training boom of the late 1930s created an unexpected opportunity. Programs at black colleges like Howard University and Hampton Institute began producing technically skilled pilots. When Chauncey Spencer and Dale White flew from Chicago to Washington, D.C. in 1939 in a rickety biplane to lobby for military aviation opportunities, they landed on the steps of the Capitol building, quite literally, creating headlines that couldn't be ignored. The pressure for change intensified as war clouds gathered over Europe. Civil rights leaders like Walter White of the NAACP, Labor leader A. Philip Randolph, and Judge William H. Hastie lobbied relentlessly for black inclusion in military aviation. Black newspapers, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American, hammered the Roosevelt administration with a simple question: how could America fight for democracy abroad while denying it at home? The Double V campaign, launched by the Pittsburgh Courier in 1942, crystallized this sentiment: victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. James G. Thompson, a cafeteria worker from Wichita, Kansas, wrote the letter that sparked the campaign: "Should I sacrifice my life to live half American?" On April 3, 1939, Public Law 18 finally cracked open the door. Senator Harry H. Schwartz had inserted an amendment requiring the civilian pilot training program to include one or more schools designated by the Civil Aeronautics Authority for the training of any Negro air pilot. It was a grudging concession wrapped in segregation, but it was a beginning. The selection of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama seemed deliberately designed to contain the experiment. Located deep in the segregated South, far from major cities and media attention, the school's remote location would limit publicity if the program succeeded or failed. Dr. Frederick Patterson, Tuskegee's president, accepted the challenge despite knowing his institution would become a testing ground for American racial attitudes. When Franklin Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented third term in 1940, he needed black votes in key northern cities. Eleanor Roosevelt's symbolic flight with Tuskegee instructor Chief Anderson in 1941 sent a powerful message, though the president himself remained publicly non-committal. On January 16, 1941, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson announced the formation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black flying unit. The announcement came with a caveat that revealed the military's expectations. This would be an experiment to test whether blacks could be trained as combat pilots. The word experiment would haunt the program throughout the war, implying that failure was not just possible, but expected. The selection process for Tuskegee was deliberately rigorous, perhaps hoping to prove the military's preconceptions correct. Candidates needed college degrees or equivalent technical training, physical standards that exceeded those for white pilots, and psychological evaluations that probed for any sign of instability under pressure. Of the first 271 applicants, only 13 were initially accepted. The training program at Tuskegee Institute represented both opportunity and isolation. Primary flight training occurred at Moton Field, a small grass airstrip with basic facilities that would have been considered inadequate for white training programs. The field consisted of a single 3,500-foot runway carved from Alabama cotton fields, surrounded by crude wooden hangars and barracks that baked in the summer heat and froze in winter cold. The cadets flew PT-17 Stearmans, reliable but unforgiving aircraft that demanded precision. These yellow-winged biplanes, powered by Continental radial engines, would either teach a man to fly or kill him in the attempt. Charles Chief Anderson, the civilian instructor who had logged over 3,000 flying hours, barnstorming across the South, pushed his students harder than any white training program dared. "A black pilot can't afford to make mistakes," Anderson told his students during their first day of training. "White folks are waiting for us to fail, so we must be perfect." His philosophy permeated every aspect of training. Cadets practiced emergency procedures until they could execute them blindfolded. They studied weather patterns with meteorological precision that exceeded military requirements. They memorized aircraft systems, manuals word for word. Captain Noel Parrish, who would later command Tuskegee Army Airfield, initially harbored typical Southern racial attitudes but gradually became one of the program's strongest advocates. Born in Kentucky and raised with conventional prejudices, Parrish arrived at Tuskegee expecting to confirm his assumptions about black intellectual limitations. Instead, he encountered men like Mac Ross, who held a master's degree in mathematics from West Virginia State College, and George Spanky Roberts, who could calculate complex navigation problems faster than most slide rules. These men, Parrish would later write, flew with a precision and determination I had never seen matched. They approached flying not as adventure or duty, but as sacred mission. Every flight was an opportunity to prove themselves, and they never wasted that opportunity. The transformation of white instructors like Parrish became a recurring theme at Tuskegee. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Jackson, initially skeptical of black capabilities, watched Cadet Daniel Chappie James execute a perfect chandelle maneuver in difficult crosswinds and admitted, "That was the finest piece of flying I've ever seen." The cadets lived in a strange bubble of segregated excellence. On base, they were military officers in training, treated with the respect their rank demanded. They lived in neat barracks, ate in integrated mess halls, and attended classes alongside white instructors who had grudgingly come to respect their abilities. Off base, they faced the full weight of Jim Crow segregation. Many couldn't eat at local restaurants or stay in nearby hotels, creating surreal situations where men training to risk their lives for America couldn't buy a cup of coffee in town. Lieutenant Span Watson remembered walking into a Tuskegee restaurant in his military uniform, only to be told, "We don't serve your kind here." The irony was lost on no one. These men were preparing to defend the very democracy that denied them basic human dignity. The academic curriculum at Tuskegee exceeded that of most flight training programs. Navigation classes required cadets to plot courses using celestial navigation techniques typically reserved for naval aviators. Meteorology instruction covered not just basic weather patterns, but advanced atmospheric physics. Engine mechanics courses demanded that cadets disassemble and rebuild radial engines until they could identify problems by sound alone. Dr. George Washington Carver, the famous agricultural scientist and Tuskegee faculty member, occasionally visited flight training classes. His presence reminded cadets that they represented more than military aviation. They carried the hopes of black intellectual achievement. "You are proving that the mind knows no color," Carver told one graduating class. "Soar high and take our race with you." Advanced flight training introduced cadets to combat techniques that would save their lives over Europe. They practiced formation flying in weather conditions that would ground white training squadrons. They learned to shoot accurately while pulling G-forces that made lesser pilots black out. Most importantly, they developed the teamwork and mutual trust that would characterize their combat performance. The washout rate approached 60%, compared to 40% for white pilot training programs. This wasn't accidental. Every graduate had to be undeniably excellent to counter inevitable criticism. Cadets who might have succeeded in standard programs were eliminated for minor infractions that would have been overlooked elsewhere. The survivors emerged as perhaps the most thoroughly prepared fighter pilots in American military history. Combat simulation exercises at Tuskegee pushed cadets beyond normal training limits. They practiced dogfighting maneuvers at altitudes that left them gasping for oxygen. They flew mock bombing runs against targets defended by instructors who showed no mercy for mistakes. They learned to maintain radio discipline under simulated combat stress that broke many experienced pilots. The psychological pressure was immense. Cadet Henry Pollard remembered lying awake nights wondering if he was strong enough to represent his race in aerial combat. "Every day we were reminded that failure meant more than personal disappointment," Pollard recalled. "It meant proving the racists right. That burden was heavier than any aircraft we flew." Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. understood the weight of command when he led the first 26 pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron to North Africa in April 1943. The son of America's first black general, Davis had endured 4 years of silent treatment at West Point, where no white cadet would speak to him outside of official duties. His West Point classmates had subjected him to organized harassment, hoping to force his resignation. He graduated 35th out of 276 cadets. Despite the systematic isolation, Davis's leadership style reflected his West Point experience: formal, disciplined, uncompromising. He demanded perfect military bearing from his pilots, knowing that any lapse would be magnified by critics. "We must be twice as good to be considered half as equal," he told his men, a maxim that became unofficial doctrine for the entire program. The 99th arrived at Farjuna, Tunisia, attached to the 33rd Fighter Group under Colonel William W. Spike Maumier, a commander who made no secret of his skepticism about black pilots. Maumier assigned them patrol missions over the Mediterranean, keeping them away from the real action. He wanted them to fail, and when they didn't immediately excel, he had his excuse. The morning of June 2, 1943, marked their first combat mission, an attack on the Italian-held island of Pantelleria. As their worn P-40 Warhawks climbed toward their targets, German fighters suddenly appeared like deadly angels against the Mediterranean sky. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s bore the yellow noses of veteran Jägerschwader units that had dominated European skies for 3 years. Lieutenant Willie Ashley later described the tension. "We could see the German fighters above us, like hawks circling. Every muscle in my body was coiled. We'd trained for this moment for 2 years, and now it was real. Real bullets, real death, real chance to prove ourselves." The German pilots, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, expected easy victories against what they assumed were inexperienced American pilots. What they encountered instead were men who flew with mathematical precision, maintaining perfect formation discipline while protecting their bomber charges. Lieutenant Charles Dryden, flying wing position on Captain Davis, remembered the first engagement. "The Germans came at us head-on, probably trying to scatter our formation. Instead, we tightened up and flew straight through their attack. I could see the surprise on the German pilot's face as we passed. He hadn't expected that kind of discipline from green pilots. No aircraft were lost on either side that first day, but the Germans had learned their first lesson. These pilots wouldn't break under pressure." Luftwaffe intelligence reports from that engagement noted unusual formation discipline among the American fighters, the first hint that something was different about these black pilots. But it was July 2nd, 1943, that changed everything forever. Charles Hall was flying his 8th mission, escorting B-25 Mitchell bombers attacking Castelvetrano airfield in Sicily. The weather was perfect for flying. Clear skies, unlimited visibility, gentle winds that barely ruffled the Mediterranean below. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s bore down on the bomber formation like predators sensing wounded prey. Hall later testified, "I saw 2 Focke-Wulfs following the bombers just after the bombs were dropped. I headed for the space between the fighters and bombers and managed to turn inside the Jerrys. I fired a long burst and saw my tracers penetrate the second aircraft. He was turning to the left, but suddenly fell off and headed straight into the ground." The German pilot, Unteroffizier Klaus Weber of 2/JG-53, had 19 aerial victories to his credit. He was a veteran of the Battle of Britain and the Russian front, a professional warrior who had survived 3 years of aerial combat. Yet in those 6 seconds over Sicily, he became the first Luftwaffe pilot shot down by a black American aviator. Weber's Focke-Wulf 190 disintegrated on impact with the Sicilian hillside, sending up a column of black smoke that could be seen for miles. Hall's P-40, tail number 41-13738, bore scorch marks from German machine gun fire but flew steadily back to base. The symbolism was profound. A 22-year-old from Indiana had shattered centuries of racial assumptions with accurate gunnery and steady nerves. When Hall landed, the entire base erupted in celebration. Black ground crews who had endured months of insults from white personnel finally had their answer to every slight and slur. Sergeant James McCullin, Hall's crew chief, had painted a small swastika on the P-40's fuselage before Hall could even climb out of the cockpit. "Lieutenant," McCullin said with tears streaming down his face, "you just made history." The crew chief had worked 18-hour days maintaining Hall's aircraft through 7 previous missions, knowing that mechanical failure could be blamed on black incompetence. Now his devotion had been vindicated with aerial victory. Hall's victory was the first aerial kill by a black American pilot in U.S. military history. News of the victory flashed across the Mediterranean theater and back to the United States, where black newspapers ran banner headlines celebrating the achievement. The Chicago Defender proclaimed, "Our boys can fight," while the Pittsburgh Courier declared, "Tuskegee pilot shoots down Jerry." But white media coverage was sparse and grudging. Most mainstream newspapers buried the story on inside pages, if they covered it at all. The military censors seemed reluctant to publicize black aerial victories, preferring to maintain the fiction that the war was being fought exclusively by white Americans. The German reaction was more complex. Luftwaffe intelligence officers began paying closer attention to the 99th Fighter Squadron, noting their unusual markings and tactics. Some German pilots expressed grudging respect for the disciplined formation flying they had witnessed. Others dismissed the victory as luck, unwilling to acknowledge black aerial competence. Understanding the Tuskegee Airmen's achievements requires examining the aircraft they flew and the technological challenges they overcame. Their first combat aircraft, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, was already obsolete when they arrived in North Africa. Built around the liquid-cooled Allison V1710 engine, the P-40L model used by the 99th Squadron produced only 1,325 horsepower, significantly less than German fighters of the same period. The P-40's design philosophy emphasized ruggedness over performance. Its thick wing could absorb tremendous battle damage without failing, but this same wing created drag that limited top speed to 378 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. German Messerschmitt Bf-109 G fighters could reach 428 miles per hour at 24,000 feet, giving them crucial advantages in both speed and altitude performance. But the P-40 had advantages that skilled pilots could exploit. Its turning radius was tighter than any German fighter, allowing experienced pilots to outmaneuver opponents in dogfights. The aircraft's 6.50 caliber machine guns, when properly harmonized, could destroy any enemy fighter with a well-placed burst. Most importantly, the P-40 was virtually indestructible. Many returned to base with damage that would have downed more fragile aircraft. Lieutenant Robert Dees learned this lesson firsthand during the Anzio battles. His P-40 took cannon shells through both wings and the engine cowling, yet continued flying long enough to reach Allied territory. "That old Warhawk saved my life," Dees remembered. "A German fighter would have fallen apart, but my P-40 just kept flying with holes you could put your fist through." The transition to P-51 Mustangs in July 1944 transformed the Red Tails from defensive fighters into offensive weapons capable of escorting bombers anywhere in Europe. The North American P-51D represented the pinnacle of American fighter design, combining the best features of American engineering with British engine technology. The Mustang's Packard-built Merlin engine produced 1,695 horsepower, giving the aircraft a top speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. More importantly, the P-51's laminar flow wing design and efficient aerodynamics provided extraordinary range, over 1,650 miles with drop tanks, far exceeding any other single-engine fighter. The P-51's armament consisted of 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns with 1,880 rounds of ammunition total. Each gun fired at a rate of 850 rounds per minute, creating a devastating cone of fire that could destroy any aircraft. The guns were harmonized to converge at 300 yards, the optimal range for most aerial combat encounters. Pilot comfort in the P-51 far exceeded that of earlier fighters. The cockpit featured improved visibility through a bubble canopy that provided 360-degree vision. The aircraft's pressurization system allowed pilots to operate effectively at altitudes up to 40,000 feet. Most importantly, for long escort missions, the cockpit was spacious enough for 6-hour flights without crippling fatigue. The Red Tails P-51s incorporated several field modifications that improved combat effectiveness. Ground crews added additional armor plating around the cockpit and engine compartment. They modified the radio equipment to improve communication during formation flying. Some aircraft received upgraded gun sights that improved accuracy during high-speed combat maneuvers. Maintenance challenges were constant. Operating from primitive Italian airfields, ground crews worked miracles keeping complex aircraft operational. Spare parts were chronically scarce, with the 332nd often receiving lower priority than white fighter groups. Yet the Red Tails maintained aircraft availability rates that equaled or exceeded other P-51 units. Sergeant William Wheeler, a crew chief with the 100th Fighter Squadron, exemplified this dedication. Working with improvised tools and salvaged parts, Wheeler kept his assigned P-51 flying through 89 combat missions without a single mechanical abort. "We knew our pilots' lives depended on our work," Wheeler explained. "There was no room for mistakes, theirs or ours." By January 1944, the 99th Fighter Squadron had been in combat for 7 months. But Colonel Maumier had filed a devastating report claiming they lacked aggressiveness and recommending their removal from combat. The report reached General Henry Hap Arnold, who prepared to shut down the experiment. Maumier's critique focused on intangibles: aggressiveness, initiative, fighting spirit, qualities impossible to measure objectively but loaded with racial implications. His report conveniently ignored the 99th's perfect bomber protection record and their success in ground attack missions. The black press erupted in outrage. The Chicago Defender ran headlines declaring, "Jim Crow tries to ground the 99th." The NAACP launched a letter-writing campaign that flooded the War Department with protests. Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, advisor to Eleanor Roosevelt, personally lobbied the First Lady to intervene. Then came Anzio. On January 27, 1944, the Luftwaffe launched massive raids on Allied forces at the Anzio beachhead. 15 pilots of the 99th, flying obsolete P-40s, encountered superior Focke-Wulf 190s over the battlefield. What followed would silence the critics forever. Captain Lemuel Custis led the formation that morning, spotting incoming German fighters at 15,000 feet. "Bandits 10 o'clock high," he called over the radio. The 99th climbed to meet them, turning what should have been a defensive engagement into an aggressive attack. The battle raged for 20 minutes across the skies above Anzio. Lieutenant Robert Dees shot down 2 FW-190s in quick succession, his P-40 smoking from battle damage but still flying. Captain Hall claimed 2 more victories, bringing his total to 3. Lieutenant Clarence Jameson destroyed another German fighter before his own aircraft was shot down, forcing him to bail out over Allied lines. Sources vary between 8 and 13 kills over 2 days, but the impact was undeniable. In 48 hours, flying inferior equipment, they had destroyed more enemy aircraft than they had in their previous 7 months of combat. The War Department launched a study comparing the 99th with other P-40 squadrons and concluded they were performing just as well as white units. The success at Anzio proved black pilots could excel in combat when given the opportunity. In May 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group, combining the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons, received orders that would transform them from outcasts to legends. They would join the 15th Air Force as bomber escorts, flying the long, dangerous missions deep into Nazi Germany. Colonel Benjamin Davis gathered his pilots at Ramitelli Airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast. "We cannot afford to lose bombers," he told them. "Our job is not to be aces. Our job is to bring those bombers home." This directive would define their combat philosophy. Stay with the bombers no matter what. The philosophy represented a radical departure from standard fighter tactics. Most fighter groups prioritized aerial victories over bomber protection, allowing pilots to break formation to chase German fighters. The 332nd would sacrifice individual glory for collective success, a decision that would make them legendary among bomber crews. In June 1944, General Nathan Twining ordered a systematic marking system for fighter groups. Each would receive distinctive colors for instant identification. The 332nd was assigned red, not just red noses or red bands, but entire tail sections painted crimson. The P-51 Mustangs with their red tails, red propeller spinners, and red nosebands became instantly recognizable across the European theater. The painting detail took 3 days, with every pilot personally supervising his aircraft's markings. Lieutenant Lee Archer recalled, "We wanted those red tails perfect. We knew bomber crews would be looking for them, depending on them. That red paint represented more than identification. It was our promise." The first bomber crews to receive red tail escorts didn't know their protectors were black. They only knew that these fighters stayed close, never abandoning them for easy kills. Word spread through the bomber groups. "Request the red tails if you can get them." Captain Robert Williams of the 483rd Bombardment Group later wrote, "We learned to look for those red tails. When we saw them forming up beside us, we knew we had a better chance of coming home. They stuck with us through hell itself." The 332nd developed innovative escort tactics that maximized bomber protection. They flew in 3-layer formations, close escort weaving directly above the bombers, medium escort positioned to intercept incoming fighters, and high escort watching for diving attacks. This system required precise coordination and absolute discipline. Lieutenant Edward Toppins described the technique. "We'd weave back and forth above the bombers like a protective blanket. German fighters would try to draw us away, but we stayed put. It was harder than chasing them down, but it saved lives." July 18, 1944 would test the red tails like never before. Colonel Davis led 66 Mustangs to rendezvous with bombers targeting the Luftwaffe base at Memmingen, Germany. The bombers were late. Davis made a crucial decision: orbit in enemy territory rather than return to base. When the bombers finally appeared, so did the Luftwaffe, approximately 100 German fighters attacking from multiple directions. The Germans had learned that overwhelming numbers might break the Red Tail's protective screen. The battle began at 25,000 feet and descended to treetop level. Lieutenant Clarence Lester shot down 3 German fighters in 5 minutes, his P-51 dancing through a maze of tracers and explosions. Captain Joseph Ellsbury destroyed 2 FW-190s before his own aircraft was severely damaged, forcing him to nurse his smoking Mustang back to Italy on one engine. Despite fierce defense by the 332nd, who claimed 11 to 12 victories, 15 B-17 fell to enemy fighters in 20 minutes of savage combat. The 332nd lost 3 pilots: Lieutenants Robert Hutton, Wellington Irving, and Alfred Gorham. Critics claimed the high bomber losses proved black pilots couldn't handle major battles. But operational analysis revealed the truth. The 332nd had arrived at an impossible situation, with massive German forces already engaging the bombers. They had prevented complete disaster. Without the Red Tails, the entire bomber formation might have been destroyed. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe's conventional fighters could barely challenge Allied air supremacy. But Germany had one last card: the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, it could outrun any propeller-driven aircraft. The Me-262 represented German technological desperation. Rushed into service with inadequate pilot training and chronic fuel shortages, these jets nonetheless posed a deadly threat to Allied bombers. Their 430mm cannons could destroy a B-17 with a single burst. On March 24, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group received its most challenging assignment: escort bombers 1,600 miles round trip to Berlin to attack the Daimler-Benz tank factory. Intelligence warned that Me-262s from Jagdgeschwader 7 would defend the target. Colonel Davis led 43 P-51 Mustangs into the heart of the Reich. As they approached Berlin, Me-262s appeared, the largest jet fighter force ever assembled for a single interception. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown had studied the jet's weaknesses during intelligence briefings at Ramitelli. "We knew the German jets were faster than we were," Brown explained. "Instead of going directly after them, we went away from them and then turned into their blind spots." The Me-262's superior speed became a liability in turning combat. The jets couldn't slow down quickly enough to match the Mustangs. Maneuverability. Brown shot down one Me-262, reporting, "I pulled up at him in a 15-degree climb and fired 3 long bursts from 2,000 feet at 8 o'clock to him. Almost immediately, the pilot bailed out from about 24,500 feet. The jet disintegrated in mid-air, its pilot's parachute opening safely as he drifted towards Soviet lines. Lieutenant Earl Lane performed what many considered impossible, shooting down a Me-262 with a 2,000-yard deflection shot using the new K-14 computing gun sight. The shot required precise calculation of the jet's speed, altitude, and direction. Mathematics performed in split seconds during violent aerial combat. Lieutenant Charles Brantley claimed the third jet victory that day, catching a Me-262 during its vulnerable landing approach. The destruction of 3 Me-262s in a single engagement represented more jets than most fighter groups would destroy in the entire war. Not all encounters between Tuskegee Airmen and Germans ended in victory. 32 pilots became prisoners of war, and their experiences revealed complex interactions between Nazi ideology and military reality. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson was shot down on August 12, 1944, during his 19th mission. His P-51 took flak over southern France while strafing radar installations. Captured by German soldiers, he was transported to Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe's interrogation center for captured Allied airmen. At his interrogation, the German officer had extensive intelligence about the 332nd Fighter Group. The interrogator had information about Ramitelli Airfield, about our squadron commanders, even details about my parents' home in Detroit, Jefferson recalled. He knew my father was a teacher and my mother's maiden name. Their intelligence was frighteningly thorough. The German officer seemed genuinely curious about black American pilots. He asked me why I was fighting for a country that treated me as a second-class citizen, Jefferson remembered. It was a question I'd asked myself many times. Inside Stalag Luft III, Jefferson found himself treated like any other American officer. White POWs from bomber crews often approached him with gratitude for red tail protection. These interactions, impossible in segregated America, occurred naturally in German prison camps. Here I was in a Nazi POW camp, being treated more equally by white Americans than I would be back home, Jefferson observed. When the war ended and Jefferson returned to the United States, he was immediately segregated at the disembarkation point, a jarring reminder of American racial reality. By war's end, the Tuskegee Airmen had compiled a combat record that demolished every pre-war assumption about black military capability. Combat operations: 1,578 combat missions, flown 15,533 individual sorties, completed 179 bomber escort missions, 311 missions for the 15th Air Force, enemy aircraft destroyed, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 150 enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground, 3 Mi-262 jet fighters shot down on March 24, 1945, ground targets destroyed, 950 rail cars, trucks and motor vehicles, 254 locomotive engines, TA-22, former Italian destroyer, Giuseppe Miraglia, damaged beyond repair on June 25, 1944. Protection record: 27 bombers lost to enemy fighters versus 46 average for other groups. Superior protection. Rate maintained across 179 escort missions. Individual achievements: Lee Archer, 4 confirmed victories. Joseph Ellsbury, 4 victories, including 3 FW-19s on July 12, 1944. Edward Toppins, 4 victories. Clarence Lester, 3 kills in 1 mission, July 18, 1944. Decorations earned: 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses for 332nd Fighter Group pilots, 744 Air Medals, 14 Bronze Stars, 8 Purple Hearts, 3 Distinguished Unit Citations for the 99th Fighter Squadron, 1 Distinguished Unit Citation for the 332nd Fighter Group. Human cost: 66 pilots killed in action, 32 pilots captured as prisoners of war, 84 killed in training and non-combat missions. Behind every pilot who shot down a German aircraft stood dozens of support personnel: mechanics, armorers, crew chiefs, radio operators, meteorologists, and intelligence specialists who kept the red tails flying. Of the approximately 16,000 Tuskegee Airmen who served during World War II, fewer than 1,000 were pilots. The remaining 15,000 were the unsung heroes who made aerial victory possible through their dedication, skill, and innovation under impossible conditions. The ground crews worked miracles with limited resources and constant discrimination. Ramitelli Airfield in Italy, the 332nd's primary base, was primitive compared to other American installations. Constructed on reclaimed swampland near the Adriatic coast, the base featured a single pierced steel plank runway that turned to mud during Italy's frequent rainstorms. Hangars were crude structures that provided minimal protection from the elements. Spare parts were chronically scarce, with the 332nd often receiving lowest priority in the theater's supply chain. White units received new engines, propellers, and avionics, while the Red Tails made do with salvaged components and improvised repairs. Yet their aircraft availability rate, the percentage of planes ready for combat on any given day, equaled or exceeded that of better supplied white units. Sergeant James McCullin, Charles Hall's crew chief, exemplified this dedication. Working 18-hour days in Italy's mud and heat, McCullin kept Hall's P-51 Kitten flying through 68 combat missions without a single mechanical abort. His maintenance log revealed obsessive attention to detail. Engine oil changed every 15 flying hours instead of the recommended 25. Control surfaces inspected daily. Radio equipment tested before every mission. "That plane was my baby," McCullin said years later. "Every time Lieutenant Hall took off, my heart went with him. I knew that if my work wasn't perfect, he might not come home. That responsibility never left me, not for a single day." McCullen's innovations became standard practice throughout the 332nd. He developed techniques for extending engine life using improvised filtration systems. He created maintenance schedules that maximized aircraft availability while minimizing risk. Most importantly, he trained junior mechanics to maintain his exacting standards, ensuring that expertise survived personnel rotations. Technical Sergeant Buford Johnson supervised armament for the entire 332nd Fighter Group, responsible for ensuring that machine guns fired accurately and reliably in combat. Johnson's crew worked through nights before major missions, loading ammunition, adjusting gun harmonization, and testing firing mechanisms. Their meticulous work contributed directly to the Red Tail's aerial victories. Johnson developed innovative techniques for improving machine gun reliability. He modified ammunition feeding mechanisms to reduce jamming rates. He created testing procedures that identified potential malfunctions before aircraft reached combat. His improvements were so effective that white fighter groups began requesting his consultation. The armament section faced unique challenges. German fighters used different ammunition types that required careful study to understand their effects on Allied aircraft. Johnson's men collected enemy shell fragments from damaged P-51s, analyzing metallurgy and explosive composition to develop better armor protection strategies. Staff Sergeant Robert Wheeler managed radio communications for the 100th Fighter Squadron, maintaining complex radio equipment that enabled coordination between widely scattered aircraft. Wheeler's innovations in radio procedure and equipment maintenance contributed significantly to the Red Tail's formation discipline and tactical effectiveness. Radio equipment in World War II fighters was notoriously unreliable. Vacuum tubes failed regularly, antennas suffered battle damage, and frequency drift made communication impossible. Wheeler's crew developed field repair techniques that kept radios operational under conditions that would have silenced other units. The meteorology section, led by Sergeant William Jackson, provided weather forecasting services that directly affected mission planning and pilot safety. Jackson's team operated primitive weather instruments from exposed positions, collecting data that determined whether missions could proceed safely. Jackson's weather predictions proved remarkably accurate, contributing to the 332nd's low accident rate and high mission completion percentage. His innovations in microclimate analysis helped pilots avoid dangerous weather conditions that claimed aircraft from other units. These ground crews also faced combat. German raids on Ramitelli were rare but deadly when they occurred. On March 24, 1944, a surprise bombing attack by Junkers Ju-88s killed several support personnel and destroyed valuable equipment. The surviving crew members continued working through the attack, pulling aircraft away from burning fuel dumps and maintaining defensive positions. Sergeant First Class David Thompson, a fuel systems specialist, died while manually pumping aviation gasoline from aircraft threatened by German bombing. His final act saved 3 P-51s and their irreplaceable pilots, though his sacrifice received no publicity and minimal recognition. The dedication of support personnel extended beyond technical competence to personal commitment that bordered on the heroic. Many worked consecutive 18-hour shifts during critical operations. They lived in primitive conditions without complaint, knowing that pilot lives depended on their expertise. They endured racial discrimination from white units while maintaining professional standards that exceeded those of better-treated colleagues. Master Sergeant Charles McGee, father of future Tuskegee pilot Charles McGee, Jr., supervised engine maintenance for the entire 332nd Fighter Group. His innovations in engine overhaul procedures extended operational life and improved reliability. McGee's techniques were eventually adopted by other P-51 units throughout the Mediterranean theater. The intelligence section, led by Lieutenant William Campbell, provided tactical information that directly influenced mission planning and pilot survival. Campbell's team analyzed German fighter tactics, identified enemy strengths and weaknesses, and developed countermeasures that gave Red Tail pilots crucial advantages in aerial combat. Campbell's intelligence reports were models of accuracy and insight. His analysis of German jet fighter capabilities proved essential during the Berlin escort missions. His tactical recommendations helped Red Tail pilots develop effective countermeasures against superior enemy aircraft. The Tuskegee Airmen fought 2 wars simultaneously, against fascism abroad and racism at home. Their combat record challenged both Nazi racial ideology and American segregation, proving that excellence in aerial combat transcended racial categorization. While the Tuskegee Airmen fought Germans abroad, they battled prejudice at home. Their victories over the Luftwaffe made headlines in black newspapers, but were often minimized or ignored by the mainstream press. The Pittsburgh Courier's Double V campaign used the Tuskegee Airmen as prime examples of this contradiction. The contrast with German awareness was stark. By 1945, the Luftwaffe reportedly knew exactly who flew the red-tailed Mustangs, calling them Schwarze Vogelmenschen. Meanwhile, many white Americans didn't know black pilots existed. This ignorance was deliberate. The War Department rarely publicized the Tuskegee Airmen's successes.